Welcome everyone. Today I'm here with Carter McNabb, one of the founding partners of GRA, and we're here to reflect on a 6 Degrees Executive and GRA webinar that was hosted yesterday, where Carter and the team went through COVID-19's impacts and particularly focused on the supply chain responses. So welcome, Carter.
Thanks, Shanaka.
Carter, firstly, I thought it was a fantastic attendance yesterday. Definitely plenty of senior management and executive interest in the topic.
Yeah, there really was, and there was a great conversation that followed the webinar. Yeah, I think that's where it really came alive. So there seemed to be a lot of engagement around the topics, and yeah, some really good discussion around the scenario planning piece, and also this sort of trade-off between, I guess, what's historically been seen as a lean supply chain versus a resilient supply chain, and how that balance might play out. So yeah, it was really good.
Fantastic, and we'll touch on plenty of themes as we go through, no doubt. I thought we'd start broad initially, Carter. Where do you see Australia being up to in I guess, the economic cycle of this crisis?
Yeah, sure, and a great question. Yeah, so there was there really two trajectories. So one's it's kind of the health trajectory, if you will. So Australia's done a great job, as we know, about flattening the curve, and we've started the economic restart program and the government's 3-step plan. But if we look at the lessons from other economies that flattened the curve and had their peak period earlier than Australia, what we see is that the economic indicators decline, sometime after that. So there's been a lot of government stimulus, as we know, into the economy. There was a lot of panic buying. So the economic indicators have actually stayed quite strong. Share market dropped quite a bit. It's recovered about half of that drop. But what we're seeing from the IMF is a prediction of a decline in GDP of 6.9%, and also unemployment increasing to 10% by the end of the year. And there's also some questions around the global economic outlook as well that need to be considered. So as much as there's some optimism, and I think that's great that there's optimism, we still need to have caution in terms of our plans moving forward, because we may not have seen the bigger wave as yet.
Absolutely, and you mentioned the bigger wave there. So in terms of the cycle, reflecting back to, I think it would have been about 6 to 8 weeks ago now, the toilet paper gate scenario that the grocery stores were grappling with. Where do you see, I guess, consumer sentiment being in that space, of where it was back then to where it is today?
It seems to be more positive. I mean, the research still shows, though, that it's still conservative. So most of the categories, broadly, in consumer goods are down, and that there's been some surveying done of the Australian population relative to the other countries, and Australia is kind of on the low end in terms of optimism, in terms of household spending. I guess my sense is it's increasing. I mean, purely kind of from an intuition perspective, it feels like things are kind of coming back to a view of normal. But again, I still think there's going to be some downward pressure relative to what we've seen. And like I said, I think if we start getting some negative economic indicators, and that gets a little bit more visible in the community, I think we might see another dip.
Absolutely.
What about you? What do you see?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that reaction element from a consumer perspective. So we saw with that run on the grocery supermarkets, definitely a reaction from consumers, and that created a demand spike. From that demand spike, where does that reset that new equilibrium is the question. And I think many of the FMCG clients are running through this scenario planning, as you say, in terms of, does that mean that we have, for example, less toilet paper demand in the future, because we know that Mary and Bob and Bill have plenty of toilet paper stored away in their households? Or does that mean that
it was them?
Yeah, it was Mary, Bob, and Jane. Or does that mean that the new norm is an increased reliance on toilet paper and those household goods, because we are spending more time at home? But all of these are scenarios that we're having to deal with now.
Yeah, that's a very good way to bring that example very close to home. So well done. In terms of, if I run out of toilet paper, so.
Yeah. In terms of the 6 Degree webinar as well, Carter, you unpacked I guess, the trajectories going forward for us from here. Can you just run me through some of those scenarios in your mind? So what would be a one path versus another from this point?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, there was some research done by Oxford Economics and McKinsey that looked at a few different GDP scenarios. And there were a number of scenarios, but to me, what was interesting is that two of them that looked to be reasonably moderate in terms of effectiveness of intervention, and then what that means for the global economy. And these two were quite close together in the matrix of those scenarios. And one had the global GDP returning to pre-crisis levels by end of 2020, and another scenario, again, which if you looked at the description of it, would seem to be very close to the one I just described, but it didn't have GDP returning to pre-crisis levels till about 2 years later than that. So I think it was around Q3 2022. So quite a big difference in terms of time frame. And so I guess what that says to me is that there's still some pretty big forks in the road that we're not sure about yet in terms of where this could go. And then, so that's kind of at a global level. Then the second layer down is, in Australia, what does that mean for the economic restart plan? There's a 3-step plan. And I think the idea is that at each step, the government will pause and see what the implications are and then decide whether to keep it at that step, move to the next one, or possibly go back. So it's not necessarily going to be a 1, 2, 3 step into the future. It could be a 1, 2 back to 1, or a 1, 2, 3 back to 2, or back to 1. So we're not really sure. And again, we then have to look at the individual supply chains in terms of sourcing, stocking, and service to customer, and what that looks like. So really, in some ways, we've got like 3 layers of scenarios that we need to be contemplating to make sure that we've got adequate plans and capability to address it, depending on what happens.
Absolutely. It really highlights the need for business to be adaptable to navigating the 3-step plan. So if we do go 1, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 3, 2, it really highlights that scenario planning, as you mentioned, is going to come to the forefront. I think what is also occurring is we'll have to be responsive at a very localized level. So where we look at our supply chains on aggregate often, we'll need to start to look at them at more of that geographic level and from a local community perspective as well as outbreaks occur. Interesting, you mentioned there as well the need for scenario planning and then investment profiles going forward. How do you see investments or investment decisions evolving through this crisis?
Yeah, well, I might take that in 2 parts. It's a really good question because the investment piece really comes more down to that trade-off between lean and resilient. So the idea that historically looking at capital allocation, shareholder demands around returns and profitability targets, and also kind of a general sense that the world was a very stable and certain place. Kind of in the background, we saw supply chains get kind of thinner and leaner and more efficient from a financial perspective, but then quite vulnerable to a crisis, which we've seen, both at a governmental level in terms of what we consider critical infrastructure now, and also at an individual supply chain level. So I think there's likely to be some government policy interventions around that. And I guess we saw that in some other economies that had a crisis like SARS. And those economies have rebounded much better than the ones that hadn't experienced that before. So there's likely to be some government intervention and policy that might change the landscape. In terms of individual boards, I think there'll be more of a balance between this idea of resiliency and lean. And if we look at long-term viability of a business and shareholder returns and risk profiles, my guess is that will start getting built into some of the financial models, and the investment community will start to take that seriously. So hopefully that will actually level the playing field between those 2 poles, which is resilience and lean. I'd love to, I guess, have a quick conversation around scenario planning capabilities, but I'll just pause there and to see, do you have any comments on that, Shanks, in terms of the resilience versus lean piece?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, it opens up broader questions around things like vertical integration for organizations as well, reliance on the export or import market. We're definitely seeing some of the news coming through at the minute around China making some decisions around some of our abattoirs in terms of limiting their import ability. So in terms of, from a demand perspective, what does that look like? But then from a supply perspective, we rely on a lot of goods coming from China as well, and those markets. So what does that look like forward? So I think to your point around investment decisions, critical infrastructure, or critical manufacturing, there's definitely a case for a new norm being established there. You're mentioning scenario planning. All of this, I'd imagine, Carter, would then feed into the different horizons you would look to do some scenario planning.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great point. So, look, I mean, at some level, scenario planning, if you look at kind of the highly evolved vision of what S&OP is, I mean, it really is a capability that involves scenario planning, the way it's being defined today. And you know, we've got a partnership with the Australian Food and Grocery Council, which is an industry that's put a lot of investment into supply chain systems and processes like S&OP. We do a survey with the AFGC, Australian Food and Grocery Council, every 2 years on the state of the supply chain. And you know, last time we ran that survey, I think 89% of the respondents said they had a formal S&OP process in place, but 60% said that their scenario planning capabilities were either non-existent or inadequate. So, that's interesting. And why is that the case? I think it really comes down to the right cultural elements and the right informational elements. So culture being around, you know, decision rights, trigger points being known, effective communication channels, psychological safety, accountability and responsibilities being aligned. But there is really a whole culture around scenario planning that makes that work. And on the other hand, it's the information, and that really means having information that's accurate at a more granular level, but then that kind of rolls up and down in a way that's fairly seamless. And then we need to have good planning, optimization, and decision support technology to do something with that data to give us that scenario planning capability. And I guess what I'd say is a lot of the organizations we've seen don't quite have that organizational maturity, and they don't quite have the systems and data capabilities yet. So it's at a good level, but it's not really at the level it needs to be to support scenario planning. Yeah, I would like, because I know you asked me a question about the horizons, and I'd like to come back to that. But before I do, what are your thoughts on that view of that kind of that fundamental capability in scenario planning, Shanks?
Yeah, I think it is particularly interesting, and you mentioned a point in the webinar that really resonated here around the companies that do well out of the crisis situations are the companies that will look not just to the reaction decisions, so not just to the decision before them, but the one beyond that decision. So, for example, where would the new equilibrium be established around demand for some of these product groups, or where will the new markets be? How do we respond to localized outbreaks, etc.? So I guess scenario planning, from my perspective, really feeds into that conversation around you know, looking beyond the first step towards the second, third, etc. So.
Yeah, good point, and I think that feeds really nicely back into the time horizons, because you know, there are a number of models for scenario planning. There's one called OODA, which is Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act, which I believe was created by an Air Force colonel named John Boyd, and that had a significant change in the way the U.S. military looked at scenario planning. And the idea was that to be able to observe, orient, decide, and act faster than the environment was changing. That was the key to success. And so the observe is really looking at what are the possible scenarios. So if we kind of look at the global economy, you know, what does GDP, you know, the GDP forecasts mean for our suppliers, our customers, and ourselves? We need to be considering it at that level. So that's one horizon. The orient horizon is more, so what are our options and how do we actually orient the operational capability of the business to be able to embed these practices that we're learning to be able to pivot. The decide piece is then comes down to what are the decisions we make more in that kind of traditional medium term, say sort of 3 to 6 months out, to make sure the supply chain capacity and capability can keep up. And then in that shorter time frame, it's act. It's what are the things we're doing to actually execute. And really, I mean, there are 4 different sort of horizons. And what we're seeing is kind of the rise of, you know, the idea of the nerve center in businesses or the control tower, which puts a group of people who have good interdisciplinary skills in a business and have an integrated view of supply chain and good analytical skills that can do some rapid response scenario modeling and kind of manage that as a control point. So we've seen some of those pop up as a result of COVID, but I believe this will become again, well, what we used to see as kind of a leading edge competitive advantage capability that wasn't widely in the Australian economy, as something that will now become mission critical. It'll be seen as essential if it's not already. So watch that space.
Yeah, and how can I guess forecasting tools and technologies support that process, Carter?
Well, I mean, again, the issue with this these days is supply chains have become quite long and quite complex. You know, we've got so many more options in the supply chain than we used to have in terms of SKU proliferation, delivery options and channels and sourcing opportunities. And, you know, the supply chain is, you know, the devil is in the detail. So I think the issue with these sorts of forecasting and planning tools is to be able to take a lot of data to basically change some of the inputs. So what if the demand does change? What if the lead times do change? What if we need to change the criticality of our service levels for some items versus others? What do we do if we change particular capacity levels in certain channels in the supply chain? And this will then, you know, replan and re-optimize based on those constraints and opportunities and let us know what that looks like. And we can look at unconstrained and constrained views to see where the gaps are. And that then helps inform investment decisions around, you know, do we actually invest in that capability or capacity or not? But the point is, I mean, it is complex. There's a lot of data, and there are some good tools that we've seen that allow that to be addressed. And so you're taking what computers are actually quite good at. And now we're also seeing some of these tools have things like, you know, leading indicator analysis and market intelligence. So, market intelligence. Pause there. Okay. So leading indicator analysis and machine learning and AI. And the reason why that's important in these sorts of tools in this type of a situation is because the past isn't necessarily as reflective of the future. And what leading indicator analysis can do and AI and machine learning is look at kind of more, if you will, kind of gross or macro events and then create correlations or relationships between those events and what we're seeing, and then use those to model out into the future. So again, it's there's a lot of excitement about machine learning and artificial intelligence, and I don't think as a thing by itself it's the answer, but it does feed into a well-established demand planning process to really feed into scenario planning. So again, I think this could be a bit of a kicker for that technology as well.
Absolutely. And to that point, I think there was a really interesting question on the webinar yesterday around what role do boards play in this space. Do you have any views on that, Carter?
Yeah, look, I think it goes back to that question around you know, resilience and lean. So again, we've seen some research that suggests that the businesses that looked resilient pre-crisis, so again, a healthier balance sheet, for example, tend to have much better results following a crisis. They tend to survive them better, and they have better results. In a lot of cases, those results are maintained because it can actually change market dynamics. So, you know, you see that in ecology as well. The idea that living systems return to their previous state post a crisis just isn't the case. There's often a significant change. So it's true in a business ecosystem as well. So I think what this will have done is created some awareness at the board level that this is important, and we might see some corporate governance initiatives around scenario planning. So what are the possible situations? How do we know that we're safe? How do we know that we're prepared? And then what are the risk and return trade-offs in relation to those scenarios? So I get a sense that that will start to come in, and it may be also led by the investment community as well. So I think it might come from two areas.
It's a really interesting point. I think that new equilibrium or state beyond the crisis, and it's, yeah, it really calls out the businesses that respond effectively will be the ones that sustain that competitive advantage into the future. I think what we're definitely seeing is a step change in supply chain capability that's required. It's definitely accelerating some existing trends. So particularly around online, we're seeing a massive shift with a lot of the retailers at the moment. How are you seeing some of those dynamics play out, Carter?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of disruption, and change across categories. And, I've already seen the rise of things like, virtual health and telemedicine. Online shopping has kind of gone through the roof. Different categories have gone really well. So anything that involves, in-home hobbies or entertainment, food and beverage, nutrition, depends on which country, but a lot of apparently the Asian countries, the nutrition products have kind of gone through the roof. So I think, short answer is, I know that there's been a lot of chopping and changing. I've seen the analysis. But the thing is, I still don't think my view is we still don't know. And that's the point, is that, so to me, a key thing that comes out of this is that, this landscape is changing very rapidly. When we initially looked at preparing the webinar presentation a couple of weeks ago, by the time we got around to delivering it, we had to update it because we'd learned some new things, there's some new information. So I think what I take from it is that the landscape remains uncertain. So I know there's some optimism returning, but we still don't know, and it's important to be aware of that. And we really have to look at that scenario planning capability to kind of map out those options and paths and give some clarity. And the third thing is we then need to start looking at how do we build resilience and this new, kind of new nerve center capability into our supply chains moving forward. And as I mentioned, I think historically they were kind of seen as a science fiction sort of luxury that you saw a lot at supply chain conferences. There are, kind of a quote unquote special few in Australia. We've seen that do this really well. We presented a case study on Simplot at a public presentation on scenario planning, and I'd say that they're one of the sort of the best I've seen at that. There may be others, but they do that well, and their business results as a result of that are very clear. So it's not pure science fiction. It does exist, but it's just not been widely distributed in the economy. And I think this is going to be the kicker that might drive all this into a higher gear, because no longer will this be a competitive advantage or a luxury. It's kind of what we need to do. But I'm not sure I answered the question you asked. What are your views on the question that you asked in terms of how you see the various categories shaping up?
Yeah, it's definitely accelerating existing trends, and I think a lot of companies are using this as a bit of a sand pit to test and trial a few, I guess, things that have been on the radar for some time. So, for example, the concept of faceless deliveries and trialing a more aggressive online markets in terms of new products or new customer bases, new delivery options, etc. Partnering with new delivery platforms as well. I think all of that is, they're definitely taking the opportunity where, in an environment where we might not have all of our stores being operational, but we have all of this inventory that might be highly fashionable, perishable, or whatever the case may be. How do we access other channels to market that can make sure that we can keep the lights on during and weather the crisis? So I think, there's been a few things I've noted in that area, which I'm sure we'll unpack over the next few weeks.
Sounds good. No, I always love hearing your thoughts on those sorts of topics, Shanks. You've always had a great eye into the future. I appreciate it. Well, I'm thinking we might wrap it up there if that works for you, Shanks. I feel yes. We've wrung this towel pretty well.
Sounds good, Carter. I look forward to the next one, and thank you again for your time.
No, thanks for your questions and your input as well, Shanks. Much appreciated.
Fantastic. Thanks.